I'm so excited for this conversation today. Amy Hollenkamp is going to be joining us in just a moment. She's a registered dietitian who specializes in IBS, low FODMAP diets, gut health, also the gut-brain connection. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, the connection between our gut and our brain. Hey everybody, hey Kier, welcome. All right, here comes Amy. Hopefully the connection is good this time. Last time it was a little wonky. Hey, Amy.
Oh, hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm good. It's actually, nice here for a change.
Oh, good. I know. I hear the birds chirping. Like almost spring. I can feel it. It's coming.
Yeah, it's kind of disorienting. I don't know, it's been so snowy here the last, 3 weeks that I'm just it's weird. It's a weird change when the temperature change is so abrupt.
Yeah.
What is grass,
Right. We haven't seen it in weeks.
I know. But it's all good.
It's all good. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. I know a lot of other people are as well.
Yeah.
We did get some awesome submitted questions, so we'll save time for that at the end as well. But I was just introducing you as a specialist in the gut health world, SIBO, IBS. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we jump in about what you do?
No, I think that's pretty good. So typically I'm working with people that have SIBO and IBS. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure you covered the bases. That tends to be kind of my niche, so to speak. So yeah.
And I noticed on your page that you also discuss a lot about the gut-brain connection. And what I love about your approach is that it's not focused in restriction, because so many SIBO diets that I see are focused on can't have this, can't have that, have to be really strict. And so you talk about how restriction can actually be detrimental. And we can talk more about that later on, because we did get a question about that. But I think you have a really functional approach for everyday life, for quality of life. So I think that's
Yeah, well, I think it'd be one thing too if I was seeing people go on these restrictive diets and their symptoms and problems were going away and things were getting better. And I think there is some benefit of restricting things like your triggers. I'm not saying eat things that you react to.
Totally.
But I think a lot of times the SIBO space and the IBS space has just taken things too far. And it can create a lot of problems that can prevent healing and moving forward from a gut health issue. So from my diet standpoint, I try to really get across to people that it's very individual. Mm-hmm. Someone with IBS and SIBO might have totally different triggers than you. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard to boil it down to these are the yes foods and these are the no foods.
Right.
And a lot of times you're going to be eliminating more foods than you have to. And then sometimes people actually are eating something that they think's great for them because it's on a yes food, but it's actually for them not great. So I think it really takes being able to learn how to listen to your body and figure out what's working for you versus listening to a list of yes and no foods. So yeah, I think the restrictive side of things is typically there's some benefit to restrict your triggers, but the idea that you can control all symptoms and kind of heal your gut through just solely diet change, I think's not an accurate picture. And usually people are focusing way too much of their energy on the diet side of things and not enough energy on other lifestyle areas that are going to be really, really beneficial and key.
Completely agree. I think that the whole mind-body piece is so important, which is kind of what we're going to talk about today, because our gut is so connected to our brain. So one of the first questions I wanted to ask you and just kind of hear your point of view is, how would you describe the gut-brain connection and why does it matter?
Yeah. I think the gut-brain connection is often referred to as the gut-brain axis as well. I think they're basically the same thing. Anytime there's an axis at the end of anything, it just means connection. Mm-hmm. So from my standpoint, I think of the gut-brain connection as being the brain, the vagus nerve, and then the gut environment, the gut nervous system, and how they're all communicating back and forth. if you think about it, like digestion's a very autonomic process. We're not telling our bodies, hey, we just ate food, it's time for you to digest. Like, we're not able to control that process. Our body just knows how to do it. There's certainly things that we can do for our body to get the signals from the brain to the gut, and even to send the right signals from the gut back to the brain. But I think it's really important to understand that, like, digestion's all autonomic controlled. So, like, stomach acid, enzyme production, motility, that's all signals that the brain is sending to the gut. And then at the same time, too, from a gut environment standpoint, you really want to make sure that the gut is sending the right messages back to the brain. So there's this bi-directional relationship. And I think sometimes what I'm seeing is that the conventional sphere, they actually acknowledge the brain-gut axis, but it's sometimes in a more dismissive way and a not helpful way. Like, oh, you have gut symptoms, you're just stressed. Like, it's kind of like this dismissive, like, oh, you're just stressed, or your anxiety is leading to the gut stuff, which can certainly be the case, but sometimes it's just brought about in sort of this dismissive way. And then at the same time, what's not discussed, but often discussed in the functional medicine space, is like that your gut can actually drive things like anxiety, depression, and mood issues. So, like, from my standpoint, sometimes, like, the functional side gets really, like, focused on, if you fix the gut, you'll fix the anxiety and mood issues, which can certainly be the case. But I think a lot of times it takes really addressing both sides of the equation, supporting, like, brain and the nervous system, but also supporting the gut environment. So from my standpoint, it's like sometimes we swing one way where it's like we think we can control, like, the balance of the gut, and that's just going to fix every mental health problem. I've seen that kind of idea. And then I also see this idea of, like, if you can control the mental health, you'll fix the gut health. But I really think it's just like you need to make sure you're covering both bases, and that's where the sweet spot is going to be, where you're going to have the best mental health and the best gut health. I think there's such a bi-directional relationship that you can't really just focus in on one. They're always going to be feeding back and forth.
Completely. They totally feed back and forth. And I think something that I've spoke about on my page is how sometimes maybe the anxiety starts, but it's hard to tell which one is started first. And then you become more anxious about your gut, and then you're anxious because you have to make all these decisions of what to eat, and so it feeds into each other for sure.
Yeah, it's like a spiral once it gets rolling, and it's it's kind of a chicken or egg scenario.
Exactly.
There's a lot of those, I think, in the gut health space, and just a lot of health issues have chicken or egg because there's multiple systems feeding into things. So it can be hard to know, like, okay, I had a really stressful, like, event happen, and then that kicked off gut stuff, but the stressful event kind of went away, but then my gut health sort of was revving up, and I was trying to control it with diet, and then there's all these decisions that come into play. And I think, I did just do a post on my page about, like, the trauma of having chronic gut issues.
Oh my God, yeah.
And, like, seeing multiple practitioners having chronic pain.
Totally.
Being on these restrictive diets and having the stress of that, like, I almost think sometimes the trauma of trying to manage some of this stuff can also keep you stuck and kind of manifest as more gut symptoms too. So I do think from a gut health standpoint, I do think, it's so imperative to not just, like, think that the mental health and things will fall into place if you can just, like, get the diet right or control more variables. It's like, having a balance in your approach, I think, is really, really helpful.
Yes, I'm so glad we're talking about this. And I think I keep going back to my experience. I know I'm like an N of one case, but a therapist was so important in just as important as my GI doctor and my dietitian in that whole process. So it's really super related. And my next question for you that I think would be interesting to discuss is specifically just focusing on gut health in the environment of our gut. How does that impact our mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like probably the biggest connection that's really focused on more so in the research as of late is the cytokine theory of depression. I don't know if you've dug into that, but it's essentially like they're in the research, they're kind of starting to link depression to inflammation. Cytokines are like these inflammatory chemicals in our body that, you know, our body, they're not necessarily good or bad, but if they get out of balance, they're going to create more inflammation. So really what the cytokine theory of depression says is that really depression is probably being driven by inflammation. And so where does a lot of inflammation start? The gut. So when 80% of the immune system about resides in the gut, and that's really what's priming inflammation, that inflammation from the gut can release like cytokines and stuff in the blood, which can then trigger inflammation in the brain. Like it sends messages back up to the brain, triggers inflammation. You also can have, if you have intestinal permeability and leaky gut, that's also going to trigger inflammation in the brain. Things like endotoxins from the gut, so toxins that bacteria can produce, can exit the gut. They can cross the blood-brain barrier and trigger inflammation in the brain. So I think the key piece is that if the gut is inflamed and imbalanced, you're going to have an inflamed brain. So it's like, and then the other way, if you have an inflamed brain and the brain's not stimulating the nervous system to digest food, you're going to have more of an inflamed gut. So there's like this cycle that happens a lot of times that can get so out of balance because, you know, you have to hit both pieces of the puzzle. But yeah, I think a lot of times, like the main driver from a gut standpoint is that, you know, toxins and things from the gut, cytokines, these inflammatory chemicals just really stimulate neuroinflammation. And the thing about neuroinflammation is there's a cell in the nervous system called microglia. Microglia they're basically the immune cells of the brain. Once they're turned on, they're really hard to turn off. So like it can be a little bit like a domino effect. And there's certain compounds that you can use to help turn off neuroinflammation. They're all natural stuff, so that's a good thing. But yeah, I mean, I think if you're trying to balance out the gut and the brain, you kind of have to address both pieces, like I was talking before. One other thing I will mention too is the vagus nerve is that like key in between that helps to bridge the connection between the brain and the gut. And what they have found too is that things like lipopolysaccharides, which are those endotoxins that can be released into the blood from the gut, actually shut down the vagus nerve. Or like, well, we're gonna like shut you up and like not have you function, and that's gonna further suppress motility, digestion, and those sorts of things. So really trying to find ways to control like permeability, inflammation in the gut, balance in the gut is typically going to help lower these cytokines, endotoxins from releasing into the blood, and it's going to lower inflammation in the brain. Yeah.
So I'm sure everyone listening is wondering, where does this inflammation in the gut come from and what can we do about it? I know it's different for everybody, but if you could speak to that, I think that would be helpful.
Right. Well, I think, you know, when it comes to inflammation in the gut, I think first off, again, if you have any sort of digestive insufficiency, it's probably going to lead to an environment where you're going to have some imbalances. So I think a lot of times what's typically driving inflammation gut-wise is just having an imbalanced gut. There's so many ways that the gut can become imbalanced. it could be food related. I mean, I ate a standard American diet growing up my whole life, so who knows what like years of Little Debbie's can have on your gut health. I'm sure it's not good. And then I think, you know, from an antibiotic standpoint too, like, I mean, I grew up, I feel like I can still taste like the bubblegum flavored antibiotic that I would get growing up, like pretty much once a year, because I would get strep throat once a year.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've kind of grown up in a society that's pretty antibiotic heavy, which can definitely imbalance things. I also think that stress is a huge one, and stress is such a broad topic, and I'm not necessarily even just talking about the mental stress, but like any sort of physical stress, like poor sleep, not getting enough outdoor light exposure, like having imbalanced circadian rhythms, not sleeping enough, having a lot of stress, you know, all are going to shut down digestive function or kind of imbalanced digestive function. And they can even change the microbiome. Like even movement's a big one. Like movement changes the microbiome in a positive way, as long as it's not like too extreme. But balanced circadian rhythms, stress management, all these things are going to help boost digestion. And there's so much just like stress built into our culture, like where it's like, oh, you have to go 110%, which makes no sense. No one can go 110%. So
rest for IBS.
Yeah, there's so much stress built into our culture that it's very normalized to not get sleep, to like skip lunch, like to eat lunch while you're working, to you know, not get enough movement, be more sedentary. Like there's so much of that built into our culture that it can be a little bit hard to maneuver. And I think just in general, I know I was talking about standard American diet, like having enough fibers in your diet can be imperative to keeping good microbes happy, healthy, which I think most, if I remember right, I think like the average fiber intake is about 15 grams in the US, maybe even less than that. Maybe it's like 10 to 15 if I remember right. So, and we're supposed to get, I think, at least 25 grams for women and 38 grams for men. So like we're well under that. I think that can definitely lead to imbalances. And we typically eat like very similar foods each day, like lack of variety. So there's a lot of input that you can have to manipulate your microbiome. I think like that's the good news about some of these things. But like I was saying before, a lot of times the focus becomes like, oh, I have to restrict to get this problem under control, when really like restriction over time can make things worse. But then you're also not able to focus on sleep, stress management, movement, doing things that are going to help the brain lifestyle wise. There's just a lot of like, I think putting things into a multifactorial plan versus just like singularly focusing on diet and supplements, which tends to be the case, I think, for a lot of people that I work with or have worked with.
100%. Yeah, it sounds like in summation, it's sleep, stress management, your exposure to light, like you said. I thought that was a really interesting point about maybe thinking about getting outside in the morning if that's accessible, and then thinking about your exposure to light at night with screen. Right. That's probably another thing that would impact our gut health.
Right. And I will say too, like I have heard this from so many moms that I almost like, I haven't necessarily blogged about it, but I think I should talk more about it with my content. But where moms are like, I was never the same after this child, or I was never the same after this pregnancy. And there can be sometimes like trauma during pregnancy if you've had like a cesarean section or something like that could be at play in it. But I think most of the time when people have pretty hard pregnancies and then they don't recover after, it's because their circadian rhythms are so dysregulated. When you have a kid, I mean, you have to wake up in the middle of the night, and I find that sometimes like even 5 years, 6 years down the line, moms haven't gotten their circadian rhythms back into balance from when they had kids. Like they haven't done like a reset. And I think that can be so huge. But it's just, it's one of those things that I don't think is discussed often, but I see it really, really commonly with women telling me, after the second child, I was like, I never was the same digestively.
Wow.
And again, there can be other factors like cesarean and maybe some adhesions in the mix, but I think more often than not, it's probably because their body has never really regained their proper rhythm. And it might just take, some months of really doing some circadian rhythm repair to where they can get the benefits gut-wise and just overall health-wise. I think circadian rhythms are so huge, and we just don't really discuss them enough. Yeah.
So for someone who's maybe not familiar with circadian rhythm repair and what that means, can you speak a little bit more about what that would look like? I'm sure it varies, but how can we repair our circadian rhythms?
Yeah, I think one thing like with circadian rhythms, I think that helps people like conceptualize why they're important specifically for gut function is because our body wants to be anchored by a pattern. Like our body wants to be like, oh, we know that she's going to go to bed at this time, so we can release hormones that can promote sleep like melatonin. Oh, and we know she's going to wake up at this time, we can like sprinkle some more cortisol to wake her up. Like there's these, basically these circadian rhythms anchor a lot of processes, whether that's hormones, whether that's gut function. And from a gut function standpoint, if you're eating at like similar meal times, I think can be huge, because then the body knows and can be prepared for a meal. If you're eating at all different times of the day, your body's not going to be prepared for the meal and can't help you. Can't help you out, because if your body knows, hey, she eats pretty much at 8 a.m. every day, we're gonna upregulate stomach acid, bile flow, enzyme production at that time, so she digests her food well. We're gonna make sure that in place to help her digest food at that time. Even permeability has a little bit of a circadian rhythm as well. So like how leaky or not leaky the gut is depends on circadian rhythms. So like they're just heavily at play from a gut health standpoint. And I think meal timings are huge if you can hone in on those. I think sleep and wake time consistency, huge. I think what you said about getting kind of morning light, and some people are like, well, I like can't like go outside in the morning. Sometimes even just sitting by a window, like I have a window kind of coming in here that primes circadian rhythms. And I know like a lot of times people talk about how important vitamin D is to health, which I think it is. I'm not like bashing vitamin D or anything, but I also think a lot of times people that have higher vitamin D levels and are healthier have better circadian rhythms. They're getting out into the sun, and they're getting a light exposure through the eye. That's what really helps to anchor circadian rhythms. Hold on one second. I'm going to plug my phone in. It looks like I might die soon. Okay, there we go. My stand doesn't. Okay, there we go. It's on a stand, so I'm like, the thing's kind of crooked. But yeah, I mean, I think from a circadian rhythm standpoint, it's all about consistency of certain things. Trying to get some light in the morning, I think, so huge. And then at night, like trying to be cautious of blue lights and screen time. You can do things like wear blue blocking glasses. I think it's also important from the circadian rhythm experts that I know. They say it's really important to kind of dim the lights in your house too. So most of the lights that we have, like the really energy efficient light bulbs, are like super blue light heavy. So they have more of the power to disrupt rhythms. So if you know like your house has a lot of like LED type lights, you might just want to like turn them off, or like have kind of a lamp on in the background or something. I don't want people like stumbling around their house and not being able to see.
Right.
But I think if you sort of are manipulating like how much light is coming in at night and really kind of keeping that on the lower side, I think that's best. For me, sometimes I'll like turn a light on sort of like in the other room, and I'll like turn it off if I go upstairs, but I try to kind of dim the lights at night.
Awesome. Those are great tips. That's perfect.
Yeah. And I think with moms too, like if you're someone that has a new baby, moms or dads that have a new baby, I actually think this is really critical to get the baby to sleep through the night. Babies don't really develop circadian rhythms until I think about 6 months is when they're starting. But like, I think even just getting the baby exposed to light in the morning, and then kind of avoiding, if you're going in for feedings, they have like red lights that you can buy. That preserves the mom and dad's circadian rhythm too. Like if you have kind of more red based light at night, and it also kind of helps preserve the baby. So if you're going in for feedings and things like that, which is the process of having a newborn baby, but even just kind of tweaking the lighting that you're using might have a big effect.
That's so interesting. I've been seeing red light therapy pop up everywhere, and I'm so curious. What are your thoughts on it? And is it important for gut health? Is it helpful?
Yeah, I'm not as like, I would say, versed in the red light therapy space. Typically, again, what I know of it is like, if you have red light, there's no blue light in it. So when I really use red lights, like I have this weird function on my phone that if I've built it in, you can find it on the internet, I think. But you can kind of program your phone. If I hit my home button 3 times, it turns like red. So at night, like if I'm on my phone, and there's like night shift and stuff, but this is like night shift on steroids. I feel like it's like red. Like people are like, what's wrong with your phone? Like you're crazy, when they look at my phone. But really, like any hues of deep red is not really going to have any blue light. Again, I wouldn't say I'm super well versed in like the red light therapy space. It's intriguing. I just haven't really dug into it. But from my standpoint, I think red light wise, it's helpful for circadian rhythms if you're waking up a lot at night. I have also seen too, like some of the shift workers that I've worked with, like it's basically impossible to get their gut in place if they're working nights. Like if you're someone that's working nights, I've had some friends too that have been nurses that have worked night shift, and it's just really hard to get things back into balance if you're a shift worker. So like if you can do things that might help you not like get out of shift work, I think that would be great. If you're someone that's stuck shift working, it's really important to be consistent with shift work, which is hard because it's like, I find that if people are doing shift work, they're doing it like 3 days a week, and then like they go back to another pattern, and the body just like never knows what's going on. So that's something to think about too, like especially if you're having a lot of symptoms and just not feeling great doing shift work, trying to kind of either divert away from shift work or really being consistent in the patterns that you're establishing with shift work.
Makes sense. That's
yeah.
So I'd love to jump into some of the submitted questions we got because I think they were awesome, and I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, how does our brain react when we don't eat enough calories or food? And I think this is what I was also wanted to ask you about restriction, and how does that impact our gut-brain axis? So
yeah.
Great.
Well, it's such a good question and something I talk about a lot. I think, I talk about how stress is going to shut down digestion in general. And I was talking about stress being problematic from a nervous system standpoint, because the vagus nerve kind of controls our rest and digest response, and our sympathetic response or our fight or flight response is kind of the antagonist to that. So you're either in this like fight or flight state or rest and digest state. And what happens when we kind of chronically undereat is our body feels stressed. It starts to pump out cortisol to kind of maintain blood sugar. The vagus nerve's not going to be stimulated as much because it's controlling that rest and digest, and you're going to be kind of more stuck in fight or flight. So I find what happens when we undereat is that we get very locked into fight or flight. A lot of our parasympathetic nervous system gets weak because we're not using it. So if you're kind of under eating, it locks you into fight or flight. It halts digestion. So you're going to have like everything that affects digestion is going to kind of go in the toilet a little bit. So you're going to have like poor stomach acid, poor enzyme release, poor bile flow, poor motility, kind of differences in motility. So really, I think undereating is a huge one. And I would say, honestly, like 90% of my clients are undereating by the time they come and see me and the restrictions they've had. And I think part of the problem too that I'm seeing is that like fasting is becoming such a big thing in the gut health space, which I think fasting can be incredibly beneficial, but like only if you're getting enough calories. Yeah. Or if you're breaking the fast. So even if you were kind of under calories for like a day or something, or, you know, you did a particular fasting style, and like even the like intermittent fasting, if that was something you were doing, I just find that people aren't like, they're doing intermittent fasting and where you're fasting a period of time, but they're never like totally breaking the fast. Like they're under calories still, like with the 2 meals that they are eating. So I find a lot of times fasting can be really beneficial in the gut health space, but like only if you're able to get enough calories. And sometimes it isn't helpful, but that can kind of create more undereating if you don't know what you're doing and not really paying attention to overall calories.
Totally. I just love that you're sharing that message. I haven't really seen that on so many other gut health pages. So I think that's so important to just bring awareness to, because that can be a result of the gut issues, but then later like a root cause of the continuing gut issues.
Right. I mean, I honestly think like even people that have been chronic dieters in the past, like I think that can be a root cause just in general. I think you're totally right. Like I think people have like some symptoms that have flared up, and then they're like, oh, I gotta like go on this diet, low FODMAP or whatever, and then unknowingly they've dropped a whole bunch of foods that they typically eat and haven't replaced them with things that are like equivalent calorically. Yeah. And so they are under, and that creates more gut issues, and it spirals. And usually, again, they've been under eating for a while, but they just haven't really paid attention. And I think the saddest thing is that like a lot of the medical system, so like if they're talking to doctors, like, you know, the doctor might give them a list of yes and no food with absolutely no guidance. Yeah. So like, here's this low FODMAP list, take it and run with it. Like, don't eat these foods. Sometimes even doctors will say, don't eat them forever. Like, you are going to be low FODMAP forever, which low FODMAP was never meant to be that, which that makes me cringe when I hear that stuff. But a lot of times there's just not enough support to how to implement the dietary changes. So, you know, people are just sent on their way and they're not looking, am I going to be able to meet my needs, or like how I'm doing this diet right now, is the composition correct to actually be able to nourish my body? Because if your body's not nourished, digestion is going to suffer. I think even a lot of micronutrient deficiencies can affect brain gut axis function, but also like just overall health. And micronutrient deficiencies start to develop over time too. Like I think thiamin's a really big one. Talking about the gut-brain connection, thiamin's so important for nervous system function. I see intake being really low among my clients because it's typically either fortified in our grains is how a lot of people are getting it, or it's in beans, like things that people aren't eating like on these restrictive diets. So thiamin's a really big one for the brain gut axis in particular that tends to be low. And it just spirals. I mean, the restrictive diets just spiral a bit, and there's just not enough support or acknowledgement like, hey, if I was a doctor in the GI space, it's probably good that someone speaks to a dietitian or someone that can help like facilitate the diet side of things, because so many people are like not implementing it correctly.
100%, right?
And I can say that as one of those people too.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So, and along those lines, can you talk about carbohydrates? So it seems like carbohydrate restriction is popular in some sort of like diet trends. And I think that's one thing that can really contribute to gut health and cortisol levels. So I would love to hear you speak about that.
Yeah. I think there's really three main issues that can come up if you're low carb for too long. Mm-hmm. And I will say too, there is some evidence that like ketogenic diets for like short periods of time might be beneficial gut wise for some people. I don't want to like totally rule that out, that there's no therapeutic benefit when there might be like, you know, some benefit very short term, but most people aren't doing these things short term. Mm-hmm. But typically it's not my first, I don't use ketogenic diets really ever, but I did just want to make that point that I do think like some people that get benefit initially, there might actually be some reasons why that's helping. But I think the three main issues that I see with low carb diets are, you mentioned some like cortisol. So cortisol's like main job, which people always think of it as like a stress hormone, like that's how it's termed, but cortisol's main job is to maintain blood sugar balance, really. So like if your blood sugar is dipping too low, your body's like, whoa, like we're going to release cortisol to help pull it from, or we're going to release cortisol to make it from protein. So cortisol really kicks off a process called gluconeogenesis, which is a fancy way of just saying that you break down protein to make glucose for the blood. Mm-hmm. So to maintain blood sugar, your body, you're not having carbs that can go directly into the blood for blood sugar. So your body has to adapt and make that from protein. And that whole process requires cortisol. So a lot of times when you dip on the lower carb side, you have these cortisol surges that aren't necessarily beneficial gut-wise, because you're just kind of stimulating cortisol all the time, and cortisol really shuts down digestion. So I think cortisol is a really big one. So that's one. I think thyroid function's huge. So from a thyroid standpoint, if you dip too low in carbs, thyroid activation, so you have T4, which is the inactive thyroid hormone, then you have T3, which is the active thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone's just generally needed for every cell of the body. It's needed for motility especially. So like if people have chronic constipation, going low carb can be really problematic because of what happens with thyroid hormones. But thyroid hormones, you get less conversion into the active form if you dip low in carbs, because that whole process is, you need insulin for it. And insulin is really stimulated when you eat carbs. And insulin gets a really bad rap, I feel like, all over the place. Yeah. But insulin's a really important hormone. And it tells your body, hey, you have enough short-term fuel to operate the metabolism efficiently. So when we eat enough carbs, like our body has more insulin and can upregulate thyroid hormone status, so it can like make sure that you have enough thyroid hormones, because the metabolism feels like it can run efficiently if you're eating enough carbs. But that affects digestion too. So a lot of times what I see is that people dipping too low carb, they actually start to develop like sometimes hypothyroid type symptoms, where they feel fatigued, slow motility, and thyroid hormones are important for stomach acid as well. So like just everything sort of goes down from a thyroid standpoint. I see that often with my clients. They'll have suboptimal free T3 levels if they're a little bit lower in carbs. So that is the second reason. I think the third big reason is just gut health, like the microbiome. Yeah. So if you're not eating enough carbs, you're most of the time, I would say it's really rare that I'd have someone eating pretty low carb and getting enough fiber. But usually if you're lower in carb, you're not going to be getting enough soluble fibers to really keep the gut bugs happy. So a lot of times, like, diversity is going to be lower because you're not eating enough diversity in plant foods. And you're also going to have probably lower levels of things like Faecalibacteria, Akkermansia bacteria, butyrate producers. So a lot of these things that really keeps the microbiome happy, healthy, and balanced are not going to be as present. So I think really those three things, the cortisol side of things, the thyroid side of things, and just the overall gut health side of things, if you're dipping too low carb-wise, can suffer. I see it especially problematic in women too. I think we're just a lot more sensitive to having enough carb intake because our body's always trying to get a sense of, like, can we have a baby from an evolutionary standpoint? Or our body's like, oh, do we have enough fuel to produce a child and to take care of a child? Whether we want one or not at the moment, the body's always, like, checking in, and things like thyroid, cortisol are probably more easily affected in women than men, from what I've seen.
Yes, I've seen that also, and I think so much of the research, especially with intermittent fasting and ketogenic diets, has been done in men. So consider how women may be impacted, and the benefits that men have may not be applicable to women, because we're not small men. I love that.
Right.
There's Stacey Sims words, but I love that Stacey Sims TED Talk where she talks about how women are not small men, and we have to really kind of pay attention to that.
Right. Yeah, I think it's wild sometimes with some of, like, the nutrition research being, like, heavily, I feel like, white and male driven. And so, like, again, sometimes, I mean, even from a minority standpoint, getting a sense of, like, what someone that's Asian needs would be maybe different what I need as a Caucasian woman, you know? I think, like, there's a lot of potential areas of bias from the nutritional research side of things, just because it's lacked diversity from a gender standpoint and, like, a nationality standpoint, unfortunately.
Totally. Yeah.
I
think that's a huge problem in the nutrition.
Yeah, it's a big problem, for sure. But
so to respect your time, I'm just going to ask one more question, if that's okay. So let's see our submitted questions. I think that this one's important. How can we control or ease our stomach when we feel excited or anxious?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think, again, like, a lot of times what I like in those situations tends to be more breath work related. I think especially if, like, if you're in a situation that's making you anxious and stressed, you're not, like, typically able to go to, like, a corner and meditate or, like, do something longer and make it more of a production.
Right.
I think a lot of times too with people, like, busy moms and things like that, breath work can be a little bit more useful because, like, okay, you have to take care of your kids. It's hard to go to, like, a dark corner of your house to meditate for 20 or 30 minutes. But thinking of, like, the situation like that, if you do feel like you are at home and you can kind of just, like, go and find a quiet space to meditate or do something longer, that would be great. But I think most of the time if people are anxious or stressed, they're in a situation that they can't really jump out of a lot of times. So what I'd probably recommend doing is breath work. I think there's so many different methods. I don't necessarily think there's one method that's better than the other. I think usually methods that are going to extend the exhale are going to be more beneficial from a vagus nerve standpoint.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to kind of activate the vagus nerve and bring your body, like, down from an anxious state, doing anything that's going to extend the exhale. And some research, things like just even 4-8 breathing. So breathing in through the nose for 4 seconds, breathing out through the nose for 8 seconds, I think can be really beneficial. I think any type of breathing, I tend to try to coach people to do it through the nose. That's kind of our natural way to breathe. And it can prevent overbreathing. If you're in, like, an anxious or stress state, you're typically going to overbreathe. Like, if you think about someone having a panic attack, they're typically like it's all trying to catch their breath. Right. they're over breathing.
Yeah.
And they're taking a lot of air in, and that can tend to make anxiety worse. So anytime you're kind of controlling the breath, sometimes breath holds can be helpful. So if you're going to do like the 4-8 method, you could add a 7-second breath hold, or however many seconds you feel like you can tolerate in the middle to hold your breath. There can also be like box style breath work. So like in for the nose for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4, and then like repeat. So those would be kind of similar too. I like Buteyko style as well, which is mainly focused on just like lowering the frequency of the breath, which is similar in the same way. I also think in general, if you're having like kind of a gut related incident, I think sometimes manual like work, like figuring out the best ways to massage your gut, I think can help too. I have a podcast called I have a podcast, and my co-host on it, she has some really great great massage videos that I will try to like maybe link in some way.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of times if people are having like a particular anxious episode, or just feel like their guts going nuts for some reason, if you can steal away, do like being manual massage, I think kind of can connect you to your body in a way.
Oh, definitely.
So I like that. And again, any type of like meditation or stress management technique, everyone's going to be a little different.
Yep.
But it's just going to take kind of figuring out what works for you, and maybe trying just some of these initial strategies and seeing if they help would be what I'd recommend.
Yeah, and if you want to try those breathing techniques, I actually have a video on my Instagram live and on my YouTube channel going through the first 3 breathing exercises that you talked about. So the 1-2 breathing, lengthening out the exhale, and then a couple simple holds. So if you're interested in trying those breathing exercises, anybody that's listening, I have a YouTube video on that. So I personally love to do the 1-2 breathing, lengthening out that exhale breath when you're overwhelmed or can't sleep. I think it's so helpful to tap into the parasympathetic nervous system, like you said.
Yeah, for sure. I think like it's amazing how sometimes quickly that helps.
Yeah.
I know sometimes people are like, I don't know, like if that's going to really like pull me out if I'm having a stressful situation. And I think there's cases where it doesn't, but I think most of the time it certainly can help at least dull some of the anxiety and stress of the situation.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think what you were saying too, like how therapy was really helpful in your particular situation. I find therapy just to be really beneficial, and for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times, like if there's kind of a consistent anxiety situation where it's coming up a lot more often than not, like trying to work with someone and figure out what might be the best strategies for you, and talk through maybe some of the triggers, and getting kind of a plan together with a practitioner, like a therapist, would be really helpful.
Right. And it's so much about what we do every day versus like even in the moment, like having those strategies is really important, but also like even when we're not anxious, maintaining those meditation practices, even if it's just 5 minutes a day, making sure that we're keeping the stress levels down is so important for longevity.
Right. It's like not about just doing it in the moment. It's about doing it preventatively.
Yeah.
I would like to mention too, from like a food anxiety standpoint, because I find that's really, really common with the clients that I work with. From that standpoint, those can really drive symptoms.
Yeah.
So like if you're really anxious about adding foods in, which I get, I've been there too, like to the point where I thought eating like one Brussels sprout was gonna like destroy me.
Mm-hmm.
If you feel like you're in that personality too, where you're like stuck in a highly anxious state around food, that's something I would definitely clock and pinpoint and try to work on. You might be able to like I think if you're dipping into increasing food variety, which usually is what I work on with my clients, you might need to change your beliefs around foods, which I know sounds like interesting and kind of intense, but it's really just a gradual process. But I think, clocking how you're feeling around foods and any sort of anxiety you have about restriction is really key. Mm-hmm. And even trying to find ways to reframe how you're believing about your beliefs around food. So let's say, like, you just have these beliefs like, oh, this is a FODMAP, I can't eat this.
Yeah.
Clocking that and saying, this is my current belief, and working on changing that belief. And I'll even have people write out, like, how do I plan on reframing this? What do I feel like or how can I build some additional tools to kind of confirm that belief? So, like, how can I reaffirm that new belief over time? So it's a process, but I definitely think working through, like, food anxiety is really key to building variety and making sure you're well nourished, and
yes,
that you're getting diversity in your diet so you can maintain a more balanced microbiome. But I just wanted to throw that out there as something to think a little bit more about if you've been around the block from a gut standpoint.
100% yes. It's the mindset is really important and not often discussed. And this might sound like a little bit out there, but not really, because when I was healing, I had to literally believe that I could get better. Like, I was so in the mindset that I was sick, that I had IBS, that I was always going to have symptoms. I had to literally reframe that and believe, like, I would feel better. And that was a huge step in my healing. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that. 'Cause it's
and I think that's, like, takes what I said to the broader context of things. And I, like, very much connect with that message, because I think for me, I was stuck. Like, I think there's, like, when you first, and sometimes it takes longer from one person to the next to get out of that mentality. But I think with the SIBO trauma, it can be very easy to get stuck in, like, oh, like, I'm just going to have to deal with this. Or, like, oh, this is just how life is. Like, I'm sick. And so this kind of constant, like, I'm sick message, I have to take all these supplements because I'm sick, I have to do all this because I'm sick. Like, it's just a very constant stream. And I think you're exactly right. Like, I think from my standpoint, I've seen clients where mindset has been, like, has prevented them from moving forward, and it really takes working on the mindset piece. Mm-hmm. And even, like, I think visualizations can be really key. Mm-hmm. If you feel like you're really stuck and, like, you can't really picture yourself outside of gut issues, maybe because it's been going on for a while. So, I mean, I couldn't blame someone if they've been sort of dealing with issues for years and they just are really struggling to, like, even conceptualize what that looks like. I'll just have people try to conceptualize it. Yeah. Like, think about what your life would be like without gut issues, and, like, maybe reflect on that on a daily basis. Yeah. Like, what would that look like? Who would you be with? What would you be doing? Where would you be living? Like, just kind of thinking about what your day would be like, what a day in your life would be like if you didn't have gut issues, really kind of visualizing it. And I think the key to visualization is really pairing it with an emotion. So, like, pairing it with gratitude or joy or freedom, like, kind of these broad emotions, helps to, like, honestly trick your brain into starting to think that way, like, starting to think that that's possible. Mm-hmm. A lot of, like, visualization studies are really fascinating. Like, it almost
fascinating
from a brain standpoint, like, you lived that experience. Mm-hmm. If you just thought it through, like, from your own perspective. It's wild to me.
It's so like, it's such an important concept too, like, the embodying that feeling of what that would look like and feel like. So that's such an important point. I'm so glad that we hit on that.
It's like manifesting your future. by doing visualizations daily.
Totally. And just before Instagram kicks us off here, I just love to thank you so much for this conversation. This was one of the most amazing converstions I've ever had about gut health. Thank you so much.
I love that.
You're
High
such,
praise.
you're such a wealth of information, and we hit so many important topics, but where can people find more of your content and more of you?
Yeah, so I have a blog, SiboDiaries.com. You can find me on Instagram at Amy_Hollenkamp_RD. Again, I have a podcast, IBS Freedom Podcast, with my friend Nikki Daneza, who's also amazing. And so I think, again, like if you're struggling with SIBO, IBS, and it's kind of chronic and just getting you down, definitely kind of, you can reach out to me, connect with me on Instagram, those sorts of things. I'm happy to help support you in any way that I can, whether it's through content or if you want to just listen to the podcast, that's great. I love to connect with other people that are interested in this gut stuff and all that jazz.
Amazing. This was so great. Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. Wow.
It's a passion of mine. As someone who's kind of gone through the ringer gut-wise, I find that there's not necessarily like a middle ground voice in the gut health space, and we talk about that often on my podcast, where like me and Nikki are pretty middle of the road. Like we have some issues with some of the functional medicine practices with like hyper restrictive diets, but then also like the conventional system like obviously doesn't cover things as well as they should. So there's a lot of like, can we just like meet somewhere in the middle, like trying to find that middle voice and middle ground. That's where I try to kind of stay, is really trying to make sure that we're not doing anything that's damaging from a mindset restrictive standpoint, and making sure we're also touching on a lot of the other key aspects to getting better from an IBS SIBO standpoint.
Absolutely. I think that you do that perfectly. So
yep. I think this is a compliment fest. I'll come on anytime.
Well, thank you again. And I'm so glad that this resonated with a lot of you that were listening. And we'll have to do this again.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm down.
Thanks so much, Amy.
You're welcome. Bye. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye.